Hello everybody, this is Mr. Murdoch and let's talk a little bit about the lymphatic system and immunity. The lymphatic system and the immune system are two very overlapping systems, and their main function is to rid the body of potentially dangerous pathogens, microorganisms such as dangerous bacteria, viruses, and parasites. The lymphatic system is kind of a circulatory system here shown in green, and lymph is a fluid that moves through these vessels, lymphatic vessels, and along the way it passes through these nodules here called lymph nodes, and within those nodules are masses of white blood cells, leukocytes, and those leukocytes phagocytize and otherwise kill pathogens or potential pathogenic microorganisms through these lymph nodes. And so as the fluid moves through the lymphatic system, it essentially becomes cleansed of bacteria and viruses and the like. Immunity, as we even know in the Survivor show, has something to do with not being able to be gotten, not being able to get sick, and immunity to diseases and infectious microorganisms. So a strong immune system keeps us healthy because we're really constantly being bombarded from the environment by potentially dangerous pathogens that want to get in us, that want to consume our resources. We're moist, we're warm, we have a lot of nutrients, so we have to keep the bad guys out. So the main function of these two systems, kind of putting them together, is to prevent and fight infections. Infections essentially an invasion by some other organism. Usually they get in and then they start to reproduce, and they make us sick. We get infected, so we want to prevent that, or if it does occur, to fight the infection. So the lymph nodes, these bulbous, bulging green areas, are lymph nodes, and as the lymph proceeds, as it is conducted through the lymphatic vessels, it passes through the nodes, and the lymph nodes are where the lymph becomes clean, gets cleaned. Ultimately, all the lymph, as you see, comes up and drains into the subclavian vein. So we see over here in the right subclavian vein, we see that lymphatic vessel merging in. That's a lymphatic duct. And then over here on the left side, we also see a lymphatic duct kind of merging in at the area of the subclavian vein. And then, of course, you know that the subclavian veins end up in the superior vena cava, so essentially it's back into circulation and just about to the heart. So here's the lymph nodes removing bacteria, viruses, potentially parasitic organisms, and all sorts of debris in the lymph nodes. Ultimately, it returns the lymph to the blood. Now the lymph essentially comes or originates from the interstitial fluid, and we'll see that later. So ultimately the lymph goes from the interstitial fluid through the lymphatic system and ends up in the venous blood supply. So lymphatic vessels, sometimes just called lymphatics, shown here. Lymphatic vessels are very thin-walled. There's a low-pressure system. It's a one-way flow. And that is more or less up. Of course, if it's the head, it's coming down. It's flowing towards the subclavian veins. That's ultimately where it flows to. And it flows in a very similar manner to the way blood flows through veins. And that is with a system of one-way valves in combination with a variety of skeletal muscle movements and respiratory movements, moving the lymph through the lymphatic vessels. So there's no pump, there's no heart. It just moves through contractions of skeletal muscles and the like. So lymph is a fluid similar to plasma. It begins as essentially interstitial fluid, and we'll talk more about that later. Here are some major lymphoid organs. So this is where lymphocytes and this lymphatic process, these lymphatic functions, really occur at a high level. The spleen and the thymus, and we'll speak more on those later. The thymus is up here near the heart, and the spleen being over here on the left side of the abdomen. Lymphoid cells are involved here. Lymphocytes specifically, as we spoke of cardiovascular system, we mentioned T and B cells. We'll talk about them a lot more now. And there's also these other cells called NK cells, natural killer cells, and these are the army, the soldiers, so to speak, of our defense system. So this is our front line of defense. Lymphoid tissue is other areas of the body. We see it kind of here in the intestines and also in the lungs. Respiratory, digestive, respiratory, urinary systems, where we see congregations or little clusters of lymphocytes. And they're little security centers, checkpoint centers, where there's lymphocytes monitoring the area for potential infectious microorganisms. These are the specifically ones found near the digestive area. Peyer's patches are in the ileum of the small intestine, and the appendix, of course, is off of the colon, off of the cecum. Also, the tonsils are essentially congregations of lymphoid tissue, large nodules near the throat and the mouth. So as we mentioned previously, the flow of lymph originates in the tissue fluid. So we see it's originating here. It drains some of the tissue fluid. As many of you know, in the venous end of a capillary bed, tissue fluid enters the circulatory system through bulk flow, and it is returned to the veins and ultimately to the heart. However, at these areas, interstitial fluid, some of it is also drained through the lymphatic system. A lot of it is drained through the veins, but a small percentage is drained through the lymphatic system, and this is where lymph originates. And we'll look at this closer later, but the general direction is to the subclavian veins, as we mentioned before, just prior to the heart in the circulatory system. And along the way, the lymph flows through these cleansing areas known as lymph nodes. And in those lymph nodes are lymphocytes. So this is how it works. And this is the lymphatic system here shown in green. Here's kind of a blow-up of a vessel showing the one-way valve. Don't forget there's no pump here. So it's low pressure, and it is propelled by primarily the same mechanisms that move blood through the veins. So adjacent muscles adjacent to the lymphatic vessels, as well as the respiratory pump, which is the breathing muscles. Once you get up into the abdomen, into the torso, the breathing muscles can provide this movement needed, this compression needed to move the lymph through the one-way valves. The one-way valves are certainly required to use these muscular types of mechanisms for moving fluid. The flow goes through lymphatic capillaries to bigger conducting vessels, and ultimately to the biggest ones, ducts, and the ducts are the terminal vessels where the lymph is poured, drained into the blood, essentially. So at the small level, lymphatic capillaries absorb or drain excess interstitial fluid. So here we are in a tissue bed, a capillary bed in the tissues, and we see the lymphatic capillaries are very much intertwined with the cardiovascular capillaries. Some of the tissue fluid enters the blood here, as you know from last unit. A lot of the other tissue fluid enters the lymphatic capillaries at this point. If you look at the lymphatic capillaries, they have a very thin wall. A single layer of overlapping endothelial cells, and this forms these flap-like mini valves, and they will open due to pressure. It pushes the cells in such a way that these little valves open, and this allows the pressure to be relieved as the tissue fluid is drained out of the tissue. There's really hardly any basement membrane here. There might be a little incomplete portion, but generally speaking, it's just a single layer of endothelial cells arranged in this flap-like mini valves. And things, debris, proteins even can pass through these mini valves, especially when they're open. They tend to be open more where there's higher pressures in the interstitial fluid due to inflammation, for example, and then that pressure pushes in on the cells, and just due to their arrangement in this flap-like way, the valve opens and more fluid can enter the lymphatic system and it can drain. But always some is entering. Even without infection, without inflammation, there is some flow into the lymphatic system. Here's another view of a similar area, kind of like this view, showing the interstitial spaces, showing some cells, and kind of showing the flow of the fluid. Then you get to larger collecting vessels. From the capillaries, we move on to the vessels, and these are really similar to veins. Once again, thinner walls, lots of valves, and again, low pressure. Ultimately, these vessels converge, merge, forming larger vessels known as ducts. So the flow here is kind of like a lazy river. It might surge a little now and then, but generally speaking, it's a low velocity, low pressure. But there's movement. It's consistent. It's definitely consistent. The right lymphatic duct drains part of the body, about a quarter of the body. You see here the right upper arm and the right side of the thorax and the head. It's shown here where it's draining into the right subclavian vein. And then the thoracic duct, which essentially is the left lymphatic duct, drains the other 3/4 of the body, the main portion. The right kind of branches off here. It's not a symmetrical system. The left or the thoracic duct drains more, a larger percentage of the body. The lymph then empties, as is shown by these circles. The lymph is emptying into the blood of the subclavian veins. Down here is a very large bulging area of the lymphatic vessels known as the cisternae chylae. Cisterna chylae. And this is where all the lymph from the lower part of the body, does pass through this particular area, cisterna chylae. Lymphocytes, of course, are the main players of the lymphatic system, the main cells that do the cleaning up, and they are divided up into the T cells, T referring to thymus-dependent cells. And once again, in a soldier-like manner, a very military-like manner, they attack and destroy foreign cells, infected cells, and even cells of the body that are infected with cancer. So they not only kill foreign cells, they will kill your own cells that have become infected or become cancerous. And there are 4 types that we'll see here: cytotoxic, helper, suppressor, and regulatory T cells. And they each have their own function, but the first 2 are probably the most important for us: cytotoxic and the helper T cells, and we'll speak more of them later. These are T cells. They mature and are dependent on the thymus, which is the lymphoid organ near the heart at the base of the throat. Also memory cells, memory T cells, and we'll speak of these all later. Then there's B cells, and they are not really dependent on the thymus. They come from the bone marrow, so that's the B stands for bone and bone marrow. They ultimately differentiate into plasma cells, which make antibodies. So you've probably heard of the word antibodies, and they are produced from plasma cells, which originally came from B cells. And we'll speak more of this to come. They also form, as the T cells did, memory cells, and in both cases, memory cells remember the bad guys. They'll remember a particular antigen. They'll remember a particular infectious agent, a particular bacterium or a particular virus for next time. So the memory cells remember infectious agents for next time, and if the body happens to become infected with them again later in life, or even a few weeks later, they can get a head start on the defense. They'll remember the bad guy, and they can jump right to it and get to defending the body. So the memory cells come in handy later in life. That's why sometimes you get sick worse when you're young. You don't have very memory cells. You're just being introduced to a lot of these invading microorganisms. You get to know them as you get older, as you grow up. You get to know them, and you become your immune system becomes stronger, and it can recognize many of the pathogens that are commonly encountered. The third type of cell are natural killer cells, and we haven't mentioned those up until this point, but we'll speak of them later as well. So these are the 3 types of lymphocytes. Lymph nodes are clusters of lymphatic tissue along the vessels. They're particularly common where appendages or limbs attach to the torso. So the inguinal lymph nodes are in the inguinal area or the groin area. Axillary, there's a group of axillary lymph nodes near the shoulder area in the axilla, and then the cervical nodes are in the neck. So the neck is essentially an appendage. The head and neck are an appendage. So there's a bunch of nodes there. So essentially, these nodes are clustered and they monitor the lymph flowing in from the various appendage or the limb. And then if there's a infection or any problem in that limb, the fluid will, any of the infectious agents coming from the limb will be monitored, will be noticed by these nodes, these groups of nodes. Each node has a cortex. It's an outer layer, and a medulla is an inner layer. You'll see later. And functions, again, we've spoken of these: filtering lymph, macrophages destroying microorganisms and debris. Also, it's here that the lymph immune system becomes activated. And in case of an infection, there's kind of an alert, an alarm call. Chemicals are sent out through the body to coordinate a defensive attack. So it's very much like a war, like a battle. And here is oftentimes little stations where activation occurs and things get going, ramped up when there is an infection going on. So here's a cross-section of a lymph node, and the afferent vessels are where the fluid comes in, the lymph comes in. Here, this is the cortex of the lymph node. The inner area, you can see, is a little different pattern or makeup, and this is called the medulla. Ultimately, the fluid passes through both of these regions, being inspected by congregations of lymphocytes, and then the assumingly cleaner fluid exits the lymph node through efferent vessels to go on its way, maybe to be checked at a node later down the line. But this is how the lymph kind of flows through the nodes. And here's a photomicrograph of the inside of a lymph node showing the passageways, the spaces that the fluid flows, as well as the lymphocytes that are inspecting the lymph for invaders, for bad guys. There's a macrophage up here, lymphocytes. So a spleen is a big lymph organ. A lot of lymph immune system functions occur in the spleen. T and B cells multiply here. There's T and B cell proliferation. Also, cleans the blood. It's a highly vascular organ as well, with all of these macrophages and lymphocytes in the area, cleaning the blood of old cells and debris and platelets. The thymus also has a cortex and a medulla, and it is in the medulla that we see the T cells developing. And you don't know a lot about them yet, but you've seen their name, T cells, referring to thymus. They're big players in the immune system. They're one of our main branches of defense. It's kind of like the Army or the Navy, the T cells, a main branch of defense, and they develop in the thymus. It's a rather important gland to our immune system. These are hormones produced by the thymus that get the T cells developing. And backing up here, the thymus is larger in children, and it atrophies through age, so it gets smaller as you get older. Theoretically, because once your immune system is developed and strong, you might not need your thymus so much. Once you've got a lot of memory cells, you've got a lot of T cells through growing up, through life experience. And it basically gets smaller as one grows older.